Yemen's ousted president was known for political cunning and shifting loyalties. But on Monday, time ran out for Ali Abdullah Saleh. How will his death impact the escalating conflict and world's worst humanitarian crisis? This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to the programme. I'm Laura Kyle. Even by Yemen's standards, the days leading up to the death of Ali Abdullah Saleh were turbulent and confusing. On Saturday, the ousted president turned on the Houthi rebels he'd been backing for the past several years. He called for dialogue with Saudi Arabia, once his patron, more recently his enemy. On Monday, Saleh's rebel allies ambushed and killed him. His death only adds to the volatility surrounding a war that appears to have no end in sight and a humanitarian crisis often described as the world's worst. We'll get to our guests in just a moment, but first this report from Imtiaz Tayyab.
The killing of Ali Abdullah Saleh has plunged Yemen into even more uncertainty. The ousted president, who had been a dominant political force for over 3 decades, was killed in an attack led by Houthi fighters on Monday. Saleh had been in an alliance with the Iranian-backed rebels for more than 2 years, and his death sparked intense fighting on the streets of the capital, Sana'a.
The clashes were ongoing the entire night until the morning. If someone stepped out into the street or fled, they would have a bullet hit them in the head, chest or body.
An uneasy calm has returned to the city, with Saleh's forces and the Houthis jointly controlled and fought against the Saudi-led coalition, which supports the internationally recognized government led by Abdurrabbu Mansour Hadi. But the partnership collapsed last week, leading to major confrontations. After days of running street battles, Saleh announced he was ready for dialogue with the Saudi-led coalition if it ended its blockade of Yemen's ports and airports and allowed for more humanitarian aid. Shortly afterwards, he was dead. In response, Hadi has urged Yemenis to rise against the Houthi forces.
I call upon all of you with an open heart and a strong will to turn a new page and to get rid of such a nightmare. Let's put our hands together to end the control of these criminal gangs and to build a new united Yemen.
Saleh and the Houthis pushed out Hadi's government in January 2015 and set up their own administration, prompting the Saudi-led campaign against them. Since then, the country has been split between the Houthi rebels in the north, Hadi's administration in the south, and forces loyal to Saleh. His death could mark a turning point and risk the conflict getting worse, a conflict which has already killed nearly 10,000 people, pushed Yemen to the brink of mass starvation, and triggered what the United Nations has called the world's worst humanitarian crisis.
We remind all parties to the conflict that deliberate attacks against civilians and against civilian and medical infrastructure are clear violations of international humanitarian law and may constitute war crimes.
Saleh, a former military officer, became president of North Yemen in 1978 after a coup, and in 1990, when the North and South reunited, he was elected as the first president of the newly unified country. He was ousted in 2012 during the Arab Spring uprising, but managed to stay in the country and wielded considerable power behind the scenes. Saleh once likened his involvement in Yemeni politics as dancing on the head of snakes. And while it's not yet clear who will succeed him, or what his death will mean for the fighting on the ground or the future of Yemen, one thing appears certain. This nearly 3-year war is unlikely to come to an end anytime soon. Imtiaz Tayyab, Al Jazeera.
Okay, well, let's bring in our guests now. And joining me here on set, we have Noha Abu El Dahab. She's a visiting fellow at Brookings Doha Centre. In Sana'a, on Skype, we have the UN Resident Coordinator, Jamie McGoldrick. And in London, retired Jordanian Air Force General Mamoun Abu Nawar. Welcome, all of you. Thanks for being here on Inside Story. Jamie, first to you. What's the situation there in Sana'a, some 24 hours after the death of Saleh?
Well, I think there's a great deal of uncertainty about what is actually happening. In the streets, it looks almost like normal, except less people, less cars, but there's a lot of things happening, moving about as normal. What we haven't got is much in the way of military activity, except occasionally we have some airstrikes. And since yesterday around 4 o'clock, we had a lot of heavy airstrikes, and since then it's gone quite quiet. And what we're trying to do right now is to get out on the streets and see if we can deal with the dead bodies and see if we can get people to hospitals and start treatment for the over 400 people injured in the last 5 days.
How easy is it to move aid around the city and get help to people who need it?
Well, it's okay. I mean, right now there are the usual situation. We don't see much in the way of change in terms of checkpoints or blockages. Okay, there's a lot of debris, a lot of broken buildings and a lot of damage caused by the fighting over 5 days. But moving through the city and shops are starting to come back to life again. But our biggest concern is to let people get out and get their water and food, get people to safety and get people medical treatment if required. I mean, there's been a lot of children caught up in this who've been terrified for 5 days with really ferocious and intensive airstrikes, shelling, ground fighting. And it's been quite intense in many areas in the city which are very congested with civilian populations.
Mahmoud, Jamie was just mentioning there the airstrikes that have been hitting the city. I mean, just early hours of Tuesday morning, we had reports of Saudi planes bombing the presidential palace for the first time. Does that mark an escalation in that particular fighting?
I think what's happened really is Saleh, he thought that by splitting with the Houthi works to his advantage. And the same thing, the coalition thought that they rely on Saleh's dream, sort of, to get this and to isolate the rebel. And it did really backfire on them. What's happening now by using air power and bombing the city would not do any effect except killing civilian in actual fact. Houthi control the most of Sana'a now. They control the resources, they control the finance. It's unwinnable war, I can say. It's Saleh ruled for 30 years, and it would be difficult to predict. He dead now, so it's very hard to know what's going to happen later. But the balance of power on the ground, I think, will remain as is.
Okay.
In the future, Houthi might progress towards the south. It's very hard to beat the Houthi. Houthi is a very tough opponent to the coalition also. So, I mean, you need an international interference really to stop and freeze this war.
Okay, well, we'll get to that just a little bit later in our discussion. Just for the moment, Noha, just how strong a hold do Houthis have on Sana'a, on the capital?
Well, I mean, we know that ever since their takeover of the capital in September 2014, the Houthis have managed to gain quite a bit of ground, not just in Sana'a, but in other parts of Yemen. And so certainly in the last almost 3 years of this war now, the Houthis have gained quite a bit of control. That said, it has been 3 years, almost 3 years, and neither side has been winning this war. A great deal, a humongous human cost, political and economic cost as well. But neither side has been winning. So, it's unclear right now who's really in control.
I mean, they're celebrating the death of Salah. We can see thousands of them out on the streets. I think on the airport road, they're having a victory celebration there. But in reality, haven't the Houthis just lost half their power in losing the Salah forces?
Well, I mean, actually, the alliance between the Houthis and Saleh and his loyalists was quite weak. In fact, it was merely a tactical alliance. I think the only unifying factor really was that they were both against Hadi as president. But other than that, I mean, let's not forget they were sworn enemies for the longest time. They fought wars against each other, and so it was nothing more than a tactical alliance. And perhaps now, in retrospect, a major miscalculation on both parts.
Jamie, we've got Salah's funeral due. Do we expect some tension to be surrounding that? Because at the moment it does feel like the two sides are giving each other space in the city. But how long is that going to last?
Well, I don't know when the funeral's taking place, but I would imagine they'll try and make it a low-key event rather than cause it to be something that people can move or gravitate towards to create problems. I think the Houthis probably don't want gatherings of that kind, maybe just their own type of gatherings, as we see today. What we're worried about is that anything that when you get big numbers and you get the possibility of clashes, then you get the civilian fallout and the casualties that come with that, as we've seen over the last 5 days. And in the early time of this whole start-up of this severe conflict, it was all based on demonstrations outside the Al-Salah Mosque. And we worried in case more of that could happen again if we have similar gatherings of that kind.
Mamoun, we've heard from the exiled president, Hadi. He's obviously in Riyadh, but he's been calling on Yemenis to unite now against the Houthis. How likely is it that the Yemenis are going to answer that call?
That's very slim. The army is divided. It used to be with Hadi, with Saleh, and some of them with the Houthi. Also, it's a tribal politics, tribal system, what you got in Yemen, and it's very hard to control. They switch alliance. So Houthi got a lot of supporter from the army also in Yemen, and the tribe also around Yemen, around Sana'a. So it's very difficult to predict the future of this. Yemen, what it does need is a good leadership. I think these leaders before, they were fully corrupt, hotel government, etc. So that's really played a great impact on Yemen politics. But I think you need a good leadership, and you need to unify the people, which is very hard. Also to recruit some of the tribe against the Houthi, but that's what will work out in the future, I think.
I mean, can you even start to know where to look for that good leadership right now?
I don't know. It depends on Yemeni and the people in the region and the international community to look for a good leader, because it does really matter. Leadership, it does really matter in the Yemeni crisis, and they have to have the proper people. They have to get this inclusive government. They have to lift the coalition, the blockade on Yemen, and that would be also with the cooperation with the Houthi to get back Yemen and the people of Yemen, medicine, food, etc. That's all a big factor, and you need, I think, UN interference in that matter also.
Now, is there anyone who is likely to be able to replace Saleh, both in being able to unify his forces behind him again and take the fight to the negotiating table?
Yeah, I mean, just to follow on what the previous guest just said, it would be nice, wouldn't it, if the Yemenis could actually choose their own leader. And I say this because, as we know, regional and international actors have always had a say in the leadership of Yemen. If we look back 6 years ago when the transition agreement was signed in Riyadh, Saleh and his aides were guaranteed immunity from prosecution, and his party was granted 50% of the power in the transition. And the transfer of power to Hadi was, Hadi, as we know, was the vice president, Saleh's vice president for 16 years. So there wasn't really this genuine transition of leadership. And even though Hadi has been referred to as the internationally recognized president over and over again, that doesn't really mean very much. He doesn't really have very strong support in Yemen. He's been outside of the country for a very long time. Part of the reason that Saleh was still able to rally his supporters is that he was physically present in the country. Now, on the question of who could replace Saleh, this is the major challenge right now. This is the major question. We may be seeing, certain figures who were working with Saleh pre-2011, such as, for example, Ali Al-Ahmar, who was the leading military commander when Saleh was president. We've heard reports about Saleh's son, stepping in, or his nephew, and so on. So it is likely, I would say, that actors such as Saudi Arabia and the Emirates would be pushing those kinds of figures to take on some sort of a leadership role.
In the meantime, then, what will Iran be doing? Because Iran's back with the Houthis, and what sort of role will they be playing behind the scenes?
Well, I mean, look, with Iran, you know, there have always been some questions about the extent of Iran's control over the Houthis. Certainly, you know, there's some influence there, there's an alliance there. But we also know that the Houthis and Iran don't necessarily always see eye to eye. When the Houthis took over in September 2014, for example, apparently, you know, Iran didn't think that was a good idea, but the Houthis went ahead and did that anyway. And so it's very difficult to say how Iran will react, given the fact that we don't even know the extent of the control that they have over the Houthis.
Jamie, the UN has been brokering talks between the two sides. I mean, they haven't been going very well, have they? They've rather broken down. I know this isn't exactly your remit, but could you give us an idea of where we're at with those talks and how likely it is now that we're going to be able to get the Houthis back to the table, given that they really don't put a lot of trust and faith into the UN procedure?
Well, I think one of the things is the tragedy of this is the fact there is no political dialogue at the moment and there's no process. And as a result of that, I think the worse that becomes, or the deeper that becomes, the more tragic the humanitarian situation is. And there is no solution to this. There's no military solution to this crisis. And there's certainly no humanitarian ability for us to cover up and address and save lives and livelihoods. The task is too massive. So there's only a political solution that must be sought. And I know that the UN is still active, still trying to bring the parties around the table. But of course, what happened yesterday, that changes the whole dynamic in many ways. I think it changes the dynamic, obviously, in Sana'a, but I think it changes the dynamic in the region. And I think the UN then has to take stock of what does that mean? How can you interpret it? And I think with every situation like that comes an opportunity. And I think it's important that the international community tries to work out what this opportunity might have thrown up and then try to work it to its best ends. Today in the Security Council, there will be a discussion on Yemen, and hopefully there'll be some political insight and some support that's given to maybe some new energy put into a political process, which for the moment, or the meantime, is pretty dormant.
Mamoun, do you think the international community can perform any leverage over the Houthis, or even sort of offer an olive branch to try to bring them back into the discussion? Because they distrust the UN as a broker. They've said in the past that the UN has demanded they give too much ground. So if there is, as Jamie says, some sort of opening here, what does the international community have to do?
I think they have to work on Iran because Iran she can't put a pressure on Houthi. Otherwise, things will not work out. This war is a proxy war, and it's going to be a sectarian war in the future if the international community did not interfere. Iran is a big player, and they should consider that, and they should talk to Iran also to play to get more pressure on the Houthi, I say again, because it's a critical element on that. Otherwise, Houthi will carry on controlling, I think, most of Yemen in the future if they let go what they are doing right now. Saleh did create a big volume. Saleh was the fixture, or he was controlling the whole politics in Yemen. So it's very tough now to find a good leadership to come behind him. They get used to that, the Yemenis. So I think you need to freeze the conflict first, as I said, and lift the blockade with the cooperation with Houthi, and from there work on new state structure for Yemen. I mean, they need the help of the world to do that and to reach to end to the Yemeni crisis. But I don't see no way to win it militarily by coalition or the other player on the ground in Yemen.
And what about pressure on Saudi, Noha? I mean, they've got the one side, you've got Iran. The amount of leverage it has over the Houthis, as you said, is debatable. But Saudi is a key player. There's no denying that. What pressure can be put on Saudi to, A, lift the blockade that the UN says is just crippling humanitarian aid getting to people, and B, stopping airstrikes, like withdrawing militarily?
Well, look, I mean, yes, I think that Saudi Arabia's allies, particularly its allies in the West, namely the UK and the US, need to step up and pressure Saudi Arabia to properly lift the blockade. And in tandem with that, the arms sales need to stop. The UK and the US have been providing unconditional military support to Saudi Arabia. The US has been refueling Saudi jets in mid-air so that they can continue bombing Yemen into oblivion. So this needs to stop. There has already been a lot of pressure within the US and UK governments regarding the legality of these arms sales. And so that needs to continue and it needs to be strengthened.
But that's got nowhere. I mean, the High Court of the UK ruled that it was legal and it should continue just recently.
Right, but it's under appeal. But that pressure still needs to continue, despite the fact that unfortunately it hasn't gone anywhere. I think that sure, it's a proxy war, but it's also a Yemeni war in the sense that Yemen has always been a fragmented country. There's been the southern secessionist movement, there's been the Houthi rebellion in the north, everything in between, there's Al-Qaeda. And so the other thing that really needs to happen is that international actors such as the US need to sort of pan out from this obsession with the so-called war on terror and really look at the root causes of this conflict and try and figure out how to genuinely resolve it.
And Jamie, how urgently does this need to happen? I mean, we've had the UN warning of widespread famine for about 2 years now. How soon is that likely to happen?
Well, I mean, I think the colleagues have mentioned the importance of lifting the blockade. I mean, there are 7 million people in this country who live in a hand-to-mouth existence. They don't know where the food comes from. We are, in the humanitarian community, left to feed them because they have no means themselves. And the blockade basically cuts off commercial and humanitarian supplies. And therefore prices go up and more and more people can't afford it. The big issue right now is fuel. I mean, the fuel's not in this country because it's blocked coming in from Hodeida. Hodeida is seen as a port that's for smuggling, which is not necessarily the only port in this country that works. And we need that port to be fully functioning, and that's where it's been blocked. If they don't get the fuel in, what will happen is that there'll be a re-emergence of the cholera, which has affected almost 1 million people right now. So if we don't get that fuel in and we don't get the food in, then as time goes on and with the impact of all that's happened over the last 5 days and the increased militarization which has gone on here, I think more and more people will just start to fall into what's just called a tipping point. And when you start tipping into that zone, it's very, very hard to retrieve. You've got 500,000 kids who are in those skeletal pictures you see on television all over this whole country. And if we can't get the foodstuffs and the support to them, then we're going to have, regardless of what political solution emerges, if we don't put the brakes on this wheel turning, we've got a real serious problem. And this country will not come back easily from this tragedy. And the children and the future generation will be taken by starvation, will be taken by illnesses they shouldn't be getting, and it'll be taken by radicalization because there's no other option for them but to turn to some of these groups who are very much exploiting the vacuum in many parts of this country.
Mahmoud, what's it going to take for the world to act? Is it going to take that tipping point? Is it going to take that very tragic scenario that Jamie has just painted for us?
I mean, the Russian got to intervene. The American, which we see no inaction, they're keeping quiet what's going on in Yemen. So they have to move. This is the biggest catastrophe in the world, what's happening in Yemen. As your guest said, its blockade is one, freezing the fight is a priority now, and stop bombing by the coalition, because this will not end the war by bombing these people out. So you need the whole international community to work out on Yemen, and it remains to be seen what's going to happen in the future.
Now, what do you see immediately happening next in Yemen?
Well, despite the fact that international actors have played quite a detrimental role in Yemen, ironically, they are necessary. They're like a necessary evil, if I could say that. Now, of course, I'm talking politically. Humanitarian organizations have been doing an incredible job saving Yemeni lives. But just to pick up on Jamie's point about radicalization and my earlier point about this obsession with the war on terror, if what it takes is for the U.S. to look at this entirely as, a counterterrorism strategy, well, then, we need to look at the last few years and see how Al-Qaeda and other, extremist actors have flourished in this atmosphere, in this, ongoing conflict in Yemen. And so if that's what it takes for Yemeni lives to matter, then so be it.
Okay, there we will have to leave our discussion today. Thank you all very much for joining us. Jamie McGoldrick, Noha Abu Eldahab, and Mamoun Abu Nawar. And thank you too very much for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, that's aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, do go to our Facebook page, that's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Laura Kyle, and the whole team here, bye for now.